Mike Gatto is a longtime California politician for the Democratic Party. He is also a lawyer who runs his own law firm dealing with politics. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So, I wanted to start off by talking about crime. You just published a book about crime. For listeners who aren't aware of your background, there was a horrific thing that happened to your father. He was murdered in his home, and it seems like that crime is still unsolved. And, we're sitting here, it's Friday, September 12th, and this week has probably been a week where crime has been more in the news than really ever before. First, that horrific scene on the subway that everybody saw, and then, just 2 days ago, the assassination of Charlie Kirk on campus in Utah. So let's just take some steps back. If you can fill the readers in, a little bit on your book, and then I would love to just talk about crime on both a national and state level.
Great questions, because I do think that, political violence and, crimes like that are very much in everybody's mind this week with the horrific events that you mentioned. For people who don't know, I was serving in the state legislature. I served 4 terms in the California State Assembly. But during my second term in office, my father, actually, I take that back, it was my 3rd term. My father was murdered. He was killed in a home invasion robbery in his home in the Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles. We are going on, let's see, this will be the 12th year in November, and the crime is still unsolved. People talk a lot about how certain crimes are down, and I get really upset when people talk about statistics, because what everybody has to keep in mind is that, one murder is obviously too much. That's somebody who lost a father, lost a son, lost a brother, lost a cousin. And also, I think a lot of things with crime statistics have been not for murders, which are much harder to falsify, but for property crimes, the crime statistics aren't valid anymore, and I'm happy to get into that for various reasons. And then the third category, right, of what's in everybody's mind is political crime. It seems like we are entering an era in this country where things that are terrorism-like, things that are very much designed to scare people, are becoming, increasingly common, and that is something that all of us have to speak out against. Doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on.
Yeah, I've started seeing, and I'm curious if you agree with this because, your voting record is, quite bipartisan, even though you technically are a Democrat. I've stopped seeing the main divide in this country as right versus left or Republican, Democrat, but people that stand for capital L liberalism and people who don't. And there's sort of a myriad of examples of people in both political parties that don't really understand what it means to have free speech for everybody and, these basic rights that go across the board. And I think we've been seeing that, lately with crime, again, both on the right and the left. And there's been a really worrying uptick of just illiberal behavior that is just now in the mainstream in a way that, I don't think it was like this 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I think the assassination of Charlie Kirk, I was sort of reflecting on it. That's probably the biggest assassination in America in my lifetime. I mean, I'm in my 30s and I don't remember any more popular figures in terms of, household name being killed in broad daylight. And it's worrying. I mean, the same thing is true with the healthcare CEO that happened a couple of months ago, and how this, much of the public discussion about this afterwards isn't actually dealing with the basic principle of no, 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 it's free speech no matter what. I can come here and insult you till the end of the podcast, and we live in a free country. You can leave. You can decide, okay, I'm done with this. But the second somebody starts violence, that obviously crosses a line. Most people don't understand that, and I've seen the conversation turn to, well, a lot of his ideas were bad, and he was sort of racist, and he was, and from my perspective, that's all beyond the point, right? Like, we can abhor his ideas, but that is completely different than, being tenuous found border. I mean, how do you think we've gotten here? I mean, I think one obvious answer is social media. I think this is, going to be talked about a lot in terms of just how it makes people crazy. But I'm curious, how you would think of this from somebody, situated in politics.
Great question. So I view it as sort of a normalization of sociopathic behavior. It seems like there's if you start with a cohort of the population that, is pays a lot of attention to social media, obsesses with it every day. And on top of that, they already start with some sociopathic tendencies. They don't have empathy. They don't understand what some of the principles that you just discussed, right? Which I would describe as magnanimous behavior, gallant behavior, the ability to say, gosh, I really can't stand what this person stands for, but you know what? I stand up for the right to say it, certainly stand up for the right to believe it. Um, that is somehow transformed into my opponents deserve to die. And that is a major leap, right? I mean, that is a really profound leap. I've, been I've been part of many, many debates where, I mean, I go at it with my opponent. I love debates. And when I was in office, I held lots of town halls and held lots of debates. But then when the debate is done, you shake hands and you pat the guy on the back and, and he talks about your kids and you ask about his and, you go on with your day. This is how I think most of us were raised, right? But those principles seem like they are diminishing. It seems to be my side, right or wrong. And for whatever reason, our society, has normalized this behavior. It's, you see it with the people who somehow think that because they disagree with what Israel's doing, that Hamas should be able to be this thing that does whatever it wants to people. It somehow has become, if I disagree politically, the other side needs to die. And that is a really, really, really scary place to be going, because the times in history where we've gone down that path, it has not been a good thing for society.
So there's often, a zero sum game in the abstract, maybe not as applied to actual policy, between freedom from, say, government and safety, right? And I think what Trump has been doing in DC has really cracked this out into the open, where, listening to the right left debate about what's been going on in DC, where Trump, calling in, federal troops to, police a city that is ridden with crime. It seems like both the right and left are correct. They're just talking past each other. The right is correct when they say, but look, crime is down. And the left is correct when they say, well, this is a, worrying overreach of government on our personal liberty and freedom. And so, I've been thinking, because I spent my whole life on a college campus. I'm a rabbi. I teach Jewish studies. I talk a lot about issues that some subset of the population holds as very controversial, right? Even just saying you have anything to do with Israel nowadays, as you were saying before, some, not a lot, but some percentage of the American population thinks that I deserve, to die, probably based off of that. So I think a lot about, personal safety. And in the past, you know, I've always been, listen, I'm willing to allow a certain amount of risk because of the general principle of, I don't want a police state. I don't want to have to walk through metal detectors every time I go onto a University of California public school campus. But it does seem like we're kind of going that way. And, of course, we're recording on September 12th, the day after September 11th. I mean, I'm just old enough, barely to remember that, time, that mythical time when you can just kind of get on an airplane and anybody can go to the gate. And of course, now nobody even blinks an eye. We've just normalized it. And that's, we've become accustomed to every time you go to a concert and a music festival and, other things like that. I also spent time living in Israel. And Israel, is almost like this times five. I mean, Israel, you almost can't go anywhere. I mean, you go to a bus stop, you go to whatever, and, there's police, there's soldiers, there's checkpoints, and all of this. And, on the one hand, I don't want to live in a situation where you can't go on a bus without going through a checkpoint. On the other hand, it does seem like the balance is, sliding to the point where, okay, well, I would rather walk through metal detectors before I teach my class at UC Irvine than have a chance of being, shot in the face for teaching an opinion about Zionism that students might not like. How would you think of this? I'm curious, the narrow question of DC and Trump, because I think that's been in the news a lot, but just also the broader principles at play here.
Great question. So you start with the basic principle behind it, which is it's sad that we are having this discussion, and it's sad that you have to express something about a concern for safety for teaching at a university, right? I mean, like the fact that we're even having this discussion is sad. The second point you made, which I think is an excellent one, is that both points can be true. It can be possible that it is really troubling that we are goal creeping into what appears to be police state and an improper use of military. But at the same time, it can also be true that people are upset, people feel unsafe, and the Democratic Party has not done enough for that. I was just on another podcast and we were talking about this, and what I tried to make the point is, when you're on a schoolyard at age 6 and someone walks up to you and says, you're ugly, and the minute you're like, no, I'm not, like you've already lost, right? Like if you're reacting, like you're letting the other person take the lead, you've already lost. And the point that I made to my fellow Democrats who are in office in big cities is that nothing would have stopped us from hearing what the public is saying, which is, I don't feel safe, and doing things like, putting increased police patrols, like having police walk through the neighborhoods rather than being in cars, doing things that recognize that in certain neighborhoods that people do feel unsafe. In DC, the National Guard was like picking up litter. Nothing would stop us from having a non-police force go into these neighborhoods and just clean them up, right? Yeah, I understand. Okay, budget constraints would stop us, but the point is that people people don't want to hear when their car is broken into and their window is smashed and someone steals their catalytic converter. They don't want to hear you say, well, technically crime is down. Last year there were 61 cases and this year there's 60 cases on. I mean, like, they don't want to hear that. Like, what they want to hear is that an understanding that sometimes the statistics can be flawed. A lot of people don't even call the police anymore. A lot of people don't. The police don't fill a report. The police don't make an arrest. The DA doesn't get a conviction. If any link in that chain is broken, you don't have a statistic. So that's number one. And secondly, people just want to feel safe. And so I think that Democrats need to be proactive. Republicans need to realize the gold creep principle that, what they acknowledge with taxes, which is, it's pretty rare that a tax increase is ever truly temporary. They often become permanent. The same goes with the loss of civil liberties. It's like the frog in boiling water. At some point, you just cease to notice how different life is.
Why do you think this might be an unfair question, but I'll ask it in sort of its strongest formulation, and then I'll give you the preface. I don't really agree with what I'm about to say. Why does it seem like Democrats just don't think crime is an issue? I mean, maybe this is just bad PR on their part, but it just seems like, if there is an uptick in crime, we're obviously very far away from an election, but let's say in a year from now, somebody told you that crime was up 20%, nationally, we can almost guarantee that would mean Republicans would do well in the election. And so, why is this the case? Because anytime I actually talk to a Democrat, I've talked to many Democratic politicians. I mean, they're no more pro-crime than Republicans. But, is this policy decisions? Do you think this is, many conservatives would say, well, liberals have these, philosophic underpinnings about crime not actually being a personal choice, but being connected to underlying, socioeconomic structures. And so we shouldn't be as tough on crime, which then means if you're not as tough, you are going to allow a certain number of people who maybe are dangerous and violent to either not go to prison or to get out early. But, I would love to hear how you're thinking of this question. If you were going to sort of defend general Democratic Party platforms and policies in terms of crime, why is it that when people think tough on crime, they think Republicans?
No, that's a fair question. So I've alluded to my beliefs on this, with my answer to the last one, and I'll try to expound on them further. So it is not subjective; it is objective to say that murders are down. And murder statistics are very hard to play with because there's a body somewhere that's found, and the police have to report it to the coroner, and so on and so forth. So it is an absolute truth when Democrats say that murders are down across the country compared to, let's say, the 1980s. That is the truth. Now, why that is anybody's guess, right? It's a complex array of socioeconomic factors. Some of it is the fact that, in the advent of DNA and ubiquitous security cameras and everyone having an iPhone, criminals are really, really scared about getting caught, right? And so for a crime as serious as murder, it has suppressed that a little bit. Some of it is also very other complex socioeconomic things, which, there's study after study, with people who study this type of thing, debating why this has happened, but there's everything from birth rates to this to that to regional changes and stuff like that, to explain why murders are down. However, just about every other type of crime is up. Property crimes, hate crimes, robberies, burglaries, all of those crimes are actually up. And again, if you're saying that, in a community that, there's 50 burglaries per 1,000 people, and a few years ago there were 45 or 55, it really doesn't matter what else said and done. I mean, the people who are getting burglarized feel unsafe, right? And they felt unsafe in 1980, they felt unsafe in 1990, they feel unsafe now, right? And so I believe that, yes, some of it is that the Democratic Party rightfully believes in second chances and rightfully believes that, if someone's a first-time offender, you give them a second chance and you try to rehabilitate them. Where we as Democrats go off the rails and get into trouble, I think, is when, you've got an example of a guy who has bonked somebody over the head and stole a purse 21 times. And 21 times he's been let free with no consequences. And then the 22nd time he bonks someone over the head and that person dies, right? That's where we get into trouble. And so to me, it's just a matter of having sensible, restrictions in place where it's like, you know what? The system has to filter out who is a truly bad person and who can be rehabilitated. And we've got to do a better job at that. And we also cannot diminish crime statistics and people's sense of personal unsafety or lack of safety.
Yeah, I think if I was going to place, sort of right wing devil's advocate, I often have, the angel and devil, depending on what your political disposition is, you can decide which one's the angel and which one's the devil. But, I would say, a lot of this seems much more rooted in sort of the ideology or the philosophy behind why people commit crime. And so, it does seem generally true that Republicans stress individualism and personal responsibility a lot more than systems are to be blamed for things. And again, the answer, like most things, is probably in the middle there. But then they're less likely to say, if you did something, if you stole a purse, you are less likely culpable. And if we could only change, some of the underlying environments or whatever, then maybe when you're free in a couple of years out of prison, you won't do the same thing again. Rather than, maybe what a conservative view would be is like, listen, the vast majority of people in America are not going to commit a, violent robbery. It's just not in their disposition. They're just not going to do it. There are certain, some percentage of people in any population who are going to be, on the extremes of anything. This is true for positive things and negative things. It's true for, I don't know, sprinting and basketball skills. It's also true for, I don't know, anything from, disposition towards mathematics, towards, who's
Sure.
going to be the most aggressive and violent. And, those people just, yes, it's great, second chances, all of that, but also the sort of utilitarian cost of continuously giving second chances and all these things. At some point, that just goes off the deep end. And then you get situations. I mean, what was so horrific about this, the subway stabber who stabbed the 23-year-old Ukrainian girl is that, this was rightfully, I don't know, propped up by every Republican in the world as like, this is an example of bad Democratic policy because this person had been in jail in the past for violent acts, and then he had let go. Again, I don't know the exact policies at play, but I think that also probably is floating there in the ether as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think that you look at which crimes captivate the American consciousness now, and you look at the reaction of the people on the far right and the far left, and it's almost like we live in completely different countries, right? I mean, there, if we can't all agree that what happened on that subway was horrific and is worthy of attention and indicates a system that's really broken, then it doesn't speak well for our ability to agree on just about anything. The But at the same time, I will say that obviously when a police officer kills somebody, we should have more acknowledgement from people on the right that that is also immoral and that is wrong and that's a crime and so on and so forth. But again, the fact that like these are things that are so heavily debated, and that these things have become rallying cries as opposed to opportunities for us to think about what needs to be changed systemically, that to me shows that there is a breakdown in policymaking right now in the United States. When I was in the legislature, it wasn't that long ago. I still made an effort to reach out to everybody, not just Republican politicians, but independent voters, because my theory was always that if I come forward with a legislative idea and I can get 65% or 70% of the population to say, huh, that's a really good idea whose time has come and it needs to be done, then chances are that's a good idea. Now, if I put forth an idea and 40%, 39% are saying that's a good idea, and everybody else is like, like chances are that's not a good idea, right? And so I don't know. I mean, building consensus has a value. That's how you come back. That's how we go back to this sort of national ideal that existed when Walter Cronkite was broadcasting, which is like there is the truth. The truth exists. Um, this is the national consensus on something, and we agree something has to be done. There have been moments in our lifetimes, right? You talk about like 9/11. Like after 9/11, there was a moment of national consensus. You could argue that it was abused, right? Like going into Iraq when Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, right? That was probably an abuse of the national consensus. But the agreement that when there are times in our history where we can all agree that something has to be done, that's when the best policy is made.
Yeah, it seems like also a lot of this, eroding of liberalism also comes parallel with the distrust of institutions, and you sort of see this at every level. Now, I think a lot of people, I'm a younger millennial, and I see this with the Gen Z students that I teach, whereas I simultaneously want to defend the importance of institutions while also being very cynical and skeptical of a lot of what general institutions. I mean, just a couple examples that I wrote down. I know that you were talked a lot about COVID and overreach of power. So I think, a lot of people dealing with sort of the, COVID institutionalizations of, the CDC saying one thing and the next day changing their mind. And then the Black Lives Matter protest, all of a sudden being okay while Newport Beach was still shut down to, people surfing and they were getting tickets, all the way to things in the education system. And a lot of what we've seen, even here in California, where when parents actually open the books of what their kids are learning, it seems like there's some radical ideology that sort of, naturally spliced into it, all the way to even, debates over healthcare. I mean, we all watch that RFK Jr., really stunning, debate with virtually, everyone, Republican and Democrat. And, not to say that what RFK is doing is good. He's a little bit of a crackpot in some ways. And also a lot of the underlying points he makes about big pharma and big food and the fact that we are somehow getting less healthy, even though technology and medicine is getting better. Those do ring true. I mean, you look at the food pyramid and it's still a joke and it's still there in a lot of, nutrition offices and everything like that. And so, how do we sort of square the circle of wanting people to understand that like there is no substitute for public schools and big journalistic platforms like say CNN, the New York Times, Fox, and the CDC and all FDA. And also you should have the correct amount of cynicism and skepticism to not just believe, oh, okay, well, my professor or my doctor said this. Of course that's true. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. So I don't
Yeah,
expect
great
any
question.
black and white answers here, but
No, but there's a great question, and I do have an answer to it. So trust in American institutions. You could argue that the first, it's been a staircase where there have been several steps down, and it is, you could argue that the first step, the first landing was the assassination of JFK. And then, obviously the assassinations of the late 60s and Watergate really made us lose trust in government further. And most studies, I believe, cite those two things, the assassination of JFK and Watergate. Now that's ancient history for many of your students and for you. But then in our lifetimes, it's things like the COVID just ridiculousness, like one message today, these ridiculously, like 6 feet is a magical talisman, and wearing a piece of cloth over your mask is going to stop this. I mean, the things that were just drilled into us like dogma, and then a few years later it's like, well, yeah, that was kind of BS and like whatever. And then even right up to last year, where it's like institutions, and again, I'm not afraid to call out my party. You had people saying Joe Biden, like he's brilliant. Like, what are you talking about? Like he's total. And the one thing that every human has, we all have elderly relatives, and we're all sympathetic. We all have an elderly relative who struggled with whatever, so we can recognize it, right? And you had all these institutions telling us, including many in the media, like, oh, Joe Biden's sharp as a tack and everything's fine. And then the next day it was like, well, he's got to be removed from the ticket and it's got to be fast and it's got to happen like right away. And it was like, whoa, like I feel lied to, right? Everybody felt a little lied to. The solution, though, I believe is simple. The solution is get involved. If you think that an institution is corrupt, if you think that an institution is a conspiracy, if you think that an institution is only there to serve itself, join that institution. That sounds counterintuitive, right? But people will find out very fast that, if they believe that all of government is a conspiracy, but then they become part of government, that it's more of a bureaucracy that has occasional conspiracies, right? And now if you're a part of it, does that mean you're automatically a conspirator, or does that mean that and so the same goes for anything that people feel needs changing. Get involved. Get to know your local politician. Get to know your local health official. Get to know anybody that you think might have some role in this, and understand exactly what they are doing and let your opinion be known. That is the most powerful message I can tell to people, because they'd be surprised, especially your students, how accessible some of these officials are. And if you become a part of the institution, I think you'll learn very quick that it's not necessarily always a conspiracy.
no, I definitely agree. And I think people that want to overly conspiratize are wrong, but I also have started feeling that about the other way. I think people who want to under conspiratize
Yeah.
is wrong as well. And not to say that everything, again, conspiracies don't need to have a, top down cabal of, shadowy figures and smoke filled rooms. I mean, that's probably one way that conspiracies happen, but conspiracies can even have just bad incentives at the root of a bureaucracy. I mean, I can give an example. I'm trying to, think of which direction. I have a lot of friends that work in healthcare, so various, psychiatric or psychological, fields, and a lot of them, over the last 10 years have quietly to me expressed reservation that the extent of gender affirming care and healthcare for trans, especially with puberty blockers and stuff, is definitely past some normal Overton window of how we would think about any other thing in psychology and psychiatry. And again, this is nothing to say about how I would treat an individual student if they said they had pronouns. I would for sure respect their individual identity expression. But just in terms of how our society and the medical institutions, and so what you have, and if we can kind of blow this up to the bird's eye view, the incentive for them as a doctor is to not say anything, because if there's 10% of people that are the rah activists, right? I feel the same way about the staunch anti-Israel professors on campus, right? If you're in a department on campus, as I am, and the head of the department or some of the grad students are just, their entire mission is to tell everybody that Zionism is a reboot of Hitler 2.0, and they are so radical that if you say anything, they're going to try to dox you and they're going to try to get your job canceled. And, you're going to have all these things that like Mike Gatto is a racist, whatever, blah, blah, blah. There's a big incentive for you to just not say anything, right? I would not blame you if, you were a professor in that department and you didn't say anything. Yet when you then understand that bureaucracy is built layer after layer, you might have a health ministry, or, on the academic side, you might have an entire, I don't know, sociology department at a university come out with a statement. We think Israel's committing genocide. It's an apartheid state. It's built on colonialist land, all the, blah, blah, blahs. And from my point of view, it's not a conspiracy of like a bunch of anti-Semites sitting up there in a room saying like, haha, let's control the levers of, academia. But it has the same effect. And I think the effect on sort of the individual is to say, okay, well, now that I've kind of seen how this operates in some capacities, that then raises my skepticism for any time a big institution says anything, because my first thought is always, okay, well, is this actually the consensus of, say, all the doctors in the country, or do the loudest people who are willing to use tactics that most people are not willing to use and most people are actually desperately afraid of? I don't want to get doxxed and have my address put all over the place. So maybe I'll just be quiet about, 90% of issues. So that's more, I think, the skepticism and cynicism of when an institution says something. And I think this is actually a much harder problem to think about, because
no, that's a very, very good point. What I don't have an easy solution to it, but I do have some thoughts. So first of all, I think you're absolutely correct that the loudest, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You're right. You could have a big institution making what seems to be a very cohesive and decisive statement, but it really is just the result of a few passionate people pushing the envelope really far, and all the good people being quiet and just being like, I'm not going to speak up because of the risk to me. I will say there's two important, well, there's one other ramification of that is really, I think, dastardly and really has big consequences. And I'll also tell you what I think is a decent solution. So there's a really legendary book about politics by Chris Matthews called Hardball. And he talks about it in there. He has a chapter that is called "It's Better to Receive Than to Give," and the point of the chapter is that people believe more in a movement when they are asked to do something than when you walk up and tell them what you can do for them. And his point is, as a politician, rather than going up to people and being like, "I'm going to solve all this, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to give you that," to actually say, "Hey, I need you to do this for the movement, and I need you to do this." And studies show that the psychology of someone who's been asked to do something, it's sort of in for a dime, in for a dollar. So what I worry about with all these people who don't necessarily have an opinion, but then are asked to sign on, like, in your case, the hypothetical sociology department letter, I fear that what they're doing is that they're being sort of led along, and at some point they will actually start to believe some of these ideologies, because the brain operates that way. It's like, well, gee, I signed on this letter and I agreed and I didn't say anything, And so that might be who I am. And like you can very, very easily lead a population in that direction. And to me, that's troubling. But against this is the power of no. It is the simple power of no. And if one or two people have the courage to say no, it becomes contagious. People ask me what it's like to serve in the legislature. Legislators are like sheep. They tend to go in one direction, or they're like any other type of ungulate. They tend to stampede, right? But when I was up there and there was a bill that I really, really, really thought was stupid, I said no. I didn't not vote. I didn't take a walk. I didn't just say, gee, I'm not going to say anything. I pressed the no button, a big red button, and it was like, wow, like here's Mike, a Democrat, voting no on a Democratic bill. And it bred, when I was there was the golden age of eclectic thinking in the California legislature. There was about 25 of us out of 80 who had that approach. And there have definitely been other times in history where you don't have those courageous people. And so everybody is kind of like, gee, if I don't go along with this, I'm going to be vaporized. There is no vaporize button, folks. Like, yes, it can be awful to be doxxed, and I'm not diminishing how powerful peer pressure can be in these institutions. But I'm hoping that there will be a few courageous people who speak up and who just, where their courage becomes contagious. Because again, that is how we survive as a society.
Yeah, there also is, I mean, as I'm thinking about this, I'm like thinking of all the obvious counterpoints, but I always compare academia and politics because I feel like they're sort of very similar in terms of just, institutional structures and how you work your way up and everything like that. And there is a certain, just keep your head down and just kind of, go along with the masses until
Yes.
maybe later on you're in position of power and then you're the one who's getting to, come up with the dominant ideas. But, I see for undergrads and grad students and non-tenured professors that, pushing that red button of no does have downstream consequences of, okay, if you're a 55-year-old tenured professor who, no matter what you say in the sociology department, you're fine. I mean, listen, I always like to quote that there's a 250, I think, professors, full-time tenure track faculty in the School of Humanities at UC Irvine. There's one Republican. He actually ran for Congress, David Penn, who I know relatively well. And I always talk about this with him. And of course, he's tenured, and so yes, everyone hates him in the School of Humanities, but he can be the sort of like one Trump guy, talking about Trump, but I don't think he would have done that when he was 26 and in grad school, or 31 and before tenure. And so that's obviously a lot harder of an ask. And so
Well, there's
again, there's
strength in
no.
numbers, right? There's strength in numbers. I mean, the reason why this system is like this, which you would argue is broken, where people don't feel like they can speak their mind, is because it's very easy to pick off one or two or pick off three. But if you have a whole group of people who speak up, and again, I know this isn't ideal, and I know in real life it's a lot harder, but I still think we should keep pushing towards that ideal. I mean, it's contagious courage, right? It's this idea that you can, if you isolate one person, okay, but you can't do that to a large group that speak up.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you're, sort of injecting these ideas as much as you can into the Democratic Party. I mean, just looking to, a year-ish from now, there's going to be an open governor seat probably. Are you thinking of, ever running again? Is that sort of in the cards for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so what I tell people is it's a matter of if, not a, or I'm sorry, it's a matter of when, not a matter of if. I still have a decent war chest. I like to stay active, and I try to stay involved as much as possible, whether it's supporting good candidates or articulating my beliefs in the media, or just going out there and being involved in my community and trying to be involved in philanthropy. I have three children, and they are my everything. And but at some point, they'll be a little more grown up, and I might decide to put my toe back into it. I'm not running for governor next year, but I am. I know it's a giant field, right? It's like there's like 20 something credible candidates, and I'm trying to look at the field and decide who's going to be the absolute best for our state. Because man, I mean, we really really need somebody good in the governor's chair, and it's. For those of us who've been watching how California is headed, I think a lot of us believe that it's headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I want to actually ask you about, Israel and anti-Semitism, sort of like Jewish-centered topics in a second. But let's stick with California because I've lived in California, my whole life except for a brief stint in Jerusalem. I'm a little confused when it comes to Californian politics. Maybe you can mitigate this confusion.
Sure.
sometimes I see statistics like, the California economy props up and subsidizes the other 49 states. And, our economy is doing so well. And look at all these great statistics. And if California seceded, it's the rest of America that would be screwed and California would be fine. And then, you sort of like flip the proverbial news channel and you see like fentanyl overdoses and, homeless encampments in LA and San Francisco. And like, what the heck is happening? And people are fleeing California in droves for places like Texas and Florida. Can these both be true? Like, which is it?
Yeah, they can both be true. So California is a very big state with a lot of people, and we have a lot of industries in this state still that are tremendous drivers of tax dollars. And that's everything from Silicon Valley, many of the nascent AI companies, Hollywood, agriculture. I mean, we still have a state that generates a lot of gross domestic product. However, we also have a state that has the highest poverty. Believe it or not, it's not Mississippi or something like that. I mean, California has the most people living, percentage-wise, living beneath the poverty line. We have a homelessness problem that is not explained by weather, because there's other states that have beautiful weather that don't have the homeless problem we have. We have shocking numbers of drug overdoses. We have cities that are people are fleeing. This again, that's something that I don't think that's subjective, that's objective. And what I'm also seeing in California is, probably of all the things I've cited, it's the most dire, and that is a sense of a loss of hope, right? Like if you had a hypothetical cousin who grew up in Kansas in the middle of the country and went to university in the middle of the country, and they could move anywhere. Now they've got their degree, top of their class, and it's like, okay, like in the next 10 years, you're going to be getting a job, you're going to be buying a house, you're going to be getting a family and having kids. Like, would you advise them to move to San Francisco? I don't think so. I really don't. I think you would say, go strike out to, you might say Austin, you might say Boise, you might say Nashville, you might say Memphis, but I don't think you would say San Francisco. And that, by the way, is what has driven the California economy all these years, is all these brilliant people moving to Hollywood, moving to San Francisco to strike out on their own, to get their, their job and their family and everything like that. And if we lose that pipeline of brilliant people, it's not going to be the California that we knew growing up.
And is that a series of policies? Is that just because, I mean, one person, someone could push back and say, well, of course, because San Francisco is such a desirable place, the housing costs are astronomical, and you're just not going to be able to afford a house, and you'll be in a one-bedroom apartment until you're 40. But that's not a dig against San Francisco. That's just because it's such a desirable place. I would rather live in San Francisco than Memphis personally. I mean, I live in Irvine. It's quite an expensive area, and I am always shocked whenever I see friends of mine who have moved to other places in the country, and I'm like, wait, you got a house for what in Cleveland? And then,
Yeah.
you look at the Cleveland and, I don't want to live in a place where it's raining 5 months a year and, too hot to go outside 6 months a year and there's no mountains and no beach. And so, so how much of this is policy and how much is this just, hey, listen, California is just a great place to live. So, of course, costs and everything are going to be higher and all that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a supply and demand factor in San Francisco, but I think at the same time, when that hypothetical 22-year-old graduate and his family or her family, when they're weighing their risk reward, it's like, well, okay, so you're going to come to San Francisco. Maybe 10 years ago, it was like, well, housing was still expensive in San Francisco. And my gosh, it's going to be a long time before you get a house and you might have to move to the suburbs somewhere. But it's a great livable city and it's got all these great things, and the culture is great, and it's safe. And then you start to chip away at some of those things. It's like, well, it's not livable anymore because the streets are covered with human feces, right? And it's not safe anymore, or it's less safe. And oh, and by the way, and you're still never going to be able to afford a house. Like, at some point, the trade-offs just become too great, right? And it is a failure of policy when in California we can't take all the other wonderful places to live and make sure that they have a strong economy with good jobs and things like that. There's a county in that's in Northern California. It's called Amador County. It is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. It is so naturally beautiful, beautiful weather, gentle rolling hills, like more trees than you can imagine, creeks, streams, lakes, and it's like, but all, so much of our industry is concentrated in the Bay Area, right? And it's like, I've often wondered, if California could somehow incentivize industry to locate to other places where housing is less expensive, we would have all the traits you talk about, which is beautiful California, great weather, lots of culture, but we would also have it more spread out, and we wouldn't have these same problems that we have in, like, the San Francisco LA problem.
Got it. So while I still have you for a few more minutes, one of the tension points within the wider Democratic Party obviously revolves around Israel and all of those questions. And so we can dig down on specifics, but just how are you thinking of this from somebody who is thinking about, wider Democratic politics in terms of this pull that you have between sort of the moderates and the hard left, or I don't know if you want to, classify it any other way. But, how would you think about it if point blank you were asked if you were running in a future hypothetical election, talk to us about Israel for a few minutes.
Yeah, so great question. So I believe, so I'll start with a dire warning, and hopefully it's one that, I don't think it's one that should surprise you, and it probably won't surprise too many of your listeners. I do believe that people who support Israel, and I put myself in that camp, should understand that there is a risk of losing probably any Democrat under the age of 35. That it's possible that support of Israel, which used to be bipartisan, that in 10 years, it'll be something that is considered to be just a Republican thing. And to me, that is troubling. And you start to diagnose, like, how did this happen? And I believe you can really explain most of it with like a zoom in, zoom out, right? If you zoom in, it's like, well, here's Israel, and it's this strong state, and it's wealthy. And within Israel, the IDF is so powerful, and it's just, and it's just this really strong state of, powerful people. But then you zoom out, and it's like, well, yeah, it's surrounded by, how many different states that have called for its destruction, that each have armies, that in many cases have fought wars against Israel to try to wipe it off the map. You still have very, very powerful states that are still calling for Israel's destruction. Oh, and by the way, Israel was founded in response to probably the worst humanitarian thing that mankind has ever done. And but again, you go back to the zoom in, and it's Americans love underdogs. Americans, particularly Democrats, like to speak up for the the party that seems meeker and milder and picked on.
But
And
let me just just
yeah,
take that one line and push you a little bit. I don't think you'll be
sure.
surprised by this pushback, but I was talking to actually one of my last podcasts with a a progressive and who's still pro-Israel, and we were sort of trying to diagnose why many people who would identify as a leftist slash progressive and Zionist, that is sort of not a two political monikers that you would still have together. And what we sort of came to was, you had highlighted that, the underdog story, but at some point we have to have the goal to be for the underdogs to become successful, right? Like if, in any situation, the best part of every sports movie is when the underdog actually, trains and you have this montage of them getting fit and then them actually winning the basketball game against, the, big bad bully team. And then the movie doesn't end by everyone then flipping and hating the underdogs who then became winners. And I feel like, in some sort of, progressive ideology, it's become only about no matter what, whoever has less power is, ipso
Yes,
facto moral,
that's what I'm saying.
which actually creates this crazy system where if you talk about, let's say, race in America, right? So it's no surprise for obvious historic reasons, the average black family has a less net worth than white family. And again, much of this I do believe is due to historic injustice and,
Sure.
everything like that. But the progressive mindset, let's say we can magically snap our fingers and in 20 years that is then equal. And let's say black families actually start to unearn white families, the same mindset would then say, oh, okay, well, now you're sort of the bad guy because you have power and now your guys are the CEOs of companies.
Yes.
And like, it's just such a perverse and weird way. Like it's just such it's not even immoral. It's like a amoral. It's like they're not even
Sure.
using
No, I think
rationale.
we're saying the same thing. I think we're saying the same thing, which is, for what I think many on the left miss is that you go back to basics and you go back to history. And I'm not sure that people understand the history, but you have, first of all, the basics is that everybody's entitled to self-determination. Everybody has a homeland, and within their homeland, there is a right of self-determination. And you go back to history, and many people don't understand this, but you have 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000 years of the Jewish people being targeted, and you have a land that they were expelled from and pushed to various places around the world. And under that mentality that you're talking about, if people understood that, it would be like, well, you're okay if you stay down. But then, in the late 1940s, as a reaction to everything that is going on, Jews finally got their homeland back. And now it's like, well, you got this, now you're strong. And it's like, and that's exactly what you're saying. I think we're saying the same thing, which is like the we should be cheering that the underdog, the underdog of 2,000 years of the diaspora and suffering and pogroms and all these things finally got their homeland back and they're flourishing. But somehow we just want to fetishize the latest underdog. And I think that's a mistake.
And a lot of this, I mean, I think only recently we've become aware of just the extent of this, but a lot of the common anti-Israel talking points you hear in progressive circles are just recycled Soviet anti-Semitic talking points. I mean, it was the Soviet Union who in the 60s and 70s was propagating this Zionism is racism and, colonialism. And this was, obviously in a wider attack against, the general West,
Yeah.
everything, pre-Cold War there. And so it seems like a lot of this just isn't even really, good faith. I think separately, what I always say, I get to upset everyone when I talk about Israel, is that this doesn't mean there isn't, a good critical conversation to be had about Israeli policy and the war and
Right.
Benjamin Netanyahu and settlements. And,
Right.
but the problem that I have and, where I would want to push anybody in politics is there's like two different conversations happening in parallel and people conflate the two. One is this wider conversation where much of the criticism of Israel, from my perspective, is just obvious recycled anti-Semitism now applied to the Jewish state. Second, there is, just like any other state that's a institution that, bureaucracy that is subject to all the banality of, human, whatever, policy making that comes with good and bad. Israel's made a lot of mistakes. Israel is, it's a human run state, right? It's going to have errors. We should be able to criticize that. We have to be able to. Otherwise, it's no longer a healthy democracy. But the problem is what I've seen from a lot of Democrats in particular is they conflate the two, right? So, an example of, when Kamala Harris was running, there was she was giving some talk and there was, the anti-Israel protesters that were outside and, I think they were, boycotting her speech, but they were saying things like globalize the intifada. They were sort of recycling, Hamas and Hezbollah talking points. And at one point, Kamala Harris said, I have a lot of respect for the protesters because you're right. There is a humanitarian issue in Gaza. And in my head, these two questions are completely separate, right? Like we can't view the radical anti-Israelists as, well, they're making some good points on policy because from my perspective, they're not talking about policy. They're talking about, it's like saying, I'm going to give a very hard opinion just to see how you react. It is true that, say there were a lot of Jews who were disproportionately represented in things like, business and the economy and, things like that in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. But nobody in their right mind would say, okay, Hitler and then the Nazis are a little bit too far. But actually on this, the first 10% of Mein Kampf was actually making some good policy points. And I feel the same way about the anti-Israel movement where, of course they're making some good points. I mean, I don't like it when babies die in Gaza also, but, the extent of which it's wrapped up in their sort of, anti-Semitic ideology, I think, that needs to be a, sort of red line for me for politicians. So I promised you a strong opinion, love to see how you
No,
respond.
that's fair. And I'm going to give probably the most naive, um, I don't know, like corny, whatever answer, and feel free to just blast me for it. But people, again, I believe a lot of people don't have historical perspective. And what people can't fathom right now, because it almost sounds quaint, is how much the French and the Germans hated each other over the centuries. There is a town that is now in France that swapped hands 13 times in I forget how many 100 years period. And I visited this town, and you go there, and there's like bullet holes in the church, like the old brick cathedral. There's like bullet holes from all the various wars, and the French and the Germans hated each other. I mean, like hated each other. And there were people talking about how they're oil and water and how they're never going to get along and blah blah blah. But somehow, in the shadow of World War II in the shadow of the Cold War. Now it's like, French and Germans, they joke about each other. Yeah, they might make a wine joke or a beer joke, um, but they found a way to unify. The borders are the borders, and they have transcended this tit for tat. I like to think that if the Palestinian people could get some decent leadership, somebody who could say, you know what, we live in a beautiful region. We could become the next Qatar. We could become the next Riyadh. We could become the next whatever if we just acknowledged that Israel has a right to exist. If we just stopped the terrorism, our people could flourish. We could be strong. We could be wealthy. We could have peace if we just acknowledged that there is a right for peace for our neighbor. And for me, it's like, that's my corny hope, is that in our lifetime, we'll look back and we'll say, well, gee, this whole region is prospering because it had decent leadership, much like, France and Germany somehow found a way to work out their differences. And again, it sounds so silly when you say it, but that is something that I think we can all aim for. And then the question is, though, what happens if this continues? And I fear that if this current state of chaos and war continues, it's just going to be ugliness for generations, and that's what's at stake when the leaders decide what they want to do.
Totally. No, I mean, maybe it's, hopefully naive. I mean, I agree with you. I think, there have been cases, obviously, where different peoples and countries have been in, sort of what seems like endless war and then have overcome that. I mean, I will say, at least from my perspective, one of the biggest impediments to that happening is Western progressive slash liberals propping up these sort of more radical factions of, the Palestinian people. And so, if there was, I always, and I think this gets into the psychology of Israel. I understand, Israeli psychology. I'm not Israeli, but I'm around a lot of Israelis and have a lot of family there. And, much of the reaction you're seeing today from Israel and Gaza is directly rooted in the response that Israel saw post October 7th. In other words, if after October, and I was on campus, I remember October 8th and October 9th, getting back to the sociology department example, I mean, there were full academic departments that put out statements essentially saying, like, Israel had this coming, and what do you expect when you keep people in an open air prison?
There were departments that put in the imagery of the guy on the glider, and like, this is like a great
Totally.
it was
and,
crazy.
and so to get to Israel's psychology, this was a, oh my goodness, the entire world's against us again, we're just going to come out with a gun. If I think that my house is surrounded by a bunch of bad guys and I don't exactly see how many of them, and my daughter's asleep in the next room and I have a gun, I'm not, stopping to say, oh, well, is there just a poor gardener that's also behind my door? I'm shooting and whatever. And I think that gets to a lot of the psychology in Israel. And I think that again, but a lot of this push of why Hamas is now seen as, de facto legitimate, and all of the sort of maximalist anti-Israel position of, no, the whole thing, Israel's illegitimate, we're not talking about 67 borders here, is because, a lot of liberals or intellectuals in the West are actually saying, yes, this is great. This is the post-colonial uprising. And I actually think the Palestinian people are, the biggest losers in all this. I think the poor guy who's growing up in Gaza or the West Bank, who it's so obvious from our perspective and from Israel's perspective that if the Palestinian people just came to some sort of deal, again, it doesn't matter if it's a two-state solution or if it's some deal with Saudi Arabia or the Trump plan, they just need something to have some self-governance in some capacity that, keeps out the more radical elements of, Islamism, then they would have, better lives. But because the sort of maximalist position is continuously propped up, many young Palestinians who are 20 aren't saying, well, I wish we can get to a place where I'm just able to go to college and provide for my job. It's, wow, the whole world is behind us in this great revolution, so I want to join this great revolution, and we're going to tear down this colonialist entity, and it's going to be just like, the French in Algeria, and one day they're all just going to leave, which again, for anyone who understands history, I mean, Jews don't see their tenure in Israel as like a temporary stop to like enrich some other land of, Poland, right? Like, it's just so obvious that this is the wrong paradigm. And so, I don't know. This has obviously been an issue close to heart, and I'm frustrated by it, but I'm glad that you seem to have a little bit more optimism here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have hope. I don't know if it's optimism at this moment. It's very hard to be optimistic at this point. what people do have to realize, though, I mean, another point you made is that, Israel is a democracy. It's just like the United States. There's many parties there. There's lots of Israelis who hate Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm not a huge fan of Netanyahu. I don't think he's got the greatest bedside manner. I don't think that he's got the greatest policies. I wouldn't vote for him. But it's different. There's a difference between, going into a discussion with an Italian and saying, I really dislike Giorgia Meloni. She's awful because of X, Y, and Z. And going in and saying, well, screw Italians. You guys are all messed up. Italy has no right to exist. It's just like, whoa. Like, and that is something that I agree with you. I think there's a lot of criticisms that should normally be in the political realm and should normally be, gee, I have a difference of opinion with one of your leaders, or I have a difference of opinion with one of your, like, the state policy, all of a sudden become, gee, I hate you because you're Israel. And that is a difference, right? It is a particular quirk of the debate when it comes to Israel, where I think the opponents tend to play unfair, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm, actually going on a trip to Austria next week with my family. And, I've been, just like any country in Europe you go to nowadays, like I'm obviously not going to wear my kippah, and I've been going through my t-shirts, and my friends like to joke that half of my t-shirts are just, free shirts that I collect from Jewish organizations. And so, very carefully going through and like, oh, shoot, I can't wear this shirt because this shirt says, Jewish community of, Orange County. And this is like a serious thing. And it's not neo-Nazis in Austria that I'm worried about. I'm sure they still exist also. It's, far left or, immigrants from, wider, not all of them, of course, but immigrants from the wider Arab world that are harboring a lot of this. And, there have been cases, for any European city that you can mention right now, if we do a quick Google search in anti-Semitism in the last few years, I mean, there's horrific examples. I was just, and then I'll see if there's any other, points you want to say before we officially end. I was talking to the head doctor for the Israeli Olympic team. He actually came to UCI as sort of a visiting professor over the summer, and he was telling me about the security precautions that the Israeli security team had to have in the last Olympics. And again, this is, the Olympics obviously hosts everyone. I mean, there's a Chinese team, there's a Russian team, there's a, whatever, like any country you can imagine. And sort of the beauty of the Olympics is sports are beyond that. Then again, it's not like the Olympics were being held in, you know, in Doha, right? The Olympics were being held in, France, right?
Right.
The first country in Europe to, become liberal and, everything there. And it was like they had an entire militia. I mean, both the French army and the Israeli army, they weren't allowed to participate, from the French security. The French security said, you had this opening parade where everybody was on boats and, with the different flags of the country. Israel actually, it didn't look like this apparently from the video angle because they edited it, but Israel's boat was actually in a completely separate, unknown area that was different than
Oh my
the rest of the
gosh.
parade because they were too afraid of terrorism. So this is, I think, what a lot of Jews are thinking about. We've been talking for a while. We've covered a lot of topics. Is there any other direction or anything else that you want to discuss?
No, I promise you a little funny part of Jewish trivia that's connected to my life. So I'm of Italian descent, and I come from this region in Italy that is very famous within the Jewish world because I believe it's one of two regions in the whole world where you can still get an etrog, in English a citron, that is grown on ungrafted rootstock. And so every year, when Sukkot is around the corner, a lot of the Haredim fly in from Israel to inspect the various trees and buy these special. They're called diamantre citrons, and so it's really kind of funny, and it's a really fascinating little piece. And when you visit that part of Italy, it's just a reminder of our shared heritage and all the different times that history has overlapped, and it's to me it's really interesting, and it's so obscure, right? I promise you, obscure trivia. It's about as obscure as you can get, but it's kind of fun.
No, I love that. I feel like someone should make a maybe if you don't go back into politics, you can go into making sitcoms of like that day that the Italian farmer realizes that they have like a bad tasting lemon that sells for $30 each, assuming it's in good
Yeah,
condition, and like
like,
just being like, wait, what the heck? These things
or
are
it's like, yeah,
40
we
bucks.
never we never grafted our rootstock. We're sitting on a gold mine here, and then like no, then you have the tension too. The tension would be then the Orthodox the Orthodox rabbi's kid comes from Israel, falls in love with the Italian woman, and it's like, and their parents said, comedy ensues, right?
There we go. I love it. Okay, maybe
That's
we'll
a
have to
great
work
movie
on that.
idea.
But
That is great.
Mike, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.